welcome. Thank you for joining the digital conversation and launch of the publication, Drug Policies and Development, Conflict and Coexistence, co-hosted by the International Development Policy Journal at the Graduate Institute Geneva, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and the Center of Excellence for Research in AIDS, also known as CERiA, at University of Malaya. My name is Asan Ahmad, and I am a research associate at the Yale AIDS program in the Department of Infectious Disease at the Yale School of Medicine, and serve as your moderator for this event. So the purpose of this event is to have an evidence-based dialogue on drug policy and development and link them to the regional debates, in our case, to Southeast Asia, and provide scientific findings on the history of drug eradication, on inclusive policies, and on diverse impacts of drug policies in armed conflict situations. Specifically in the region, we see debates on the introduction of more proportionate responses to drug use in Malaysia, extrajudicial killings still ongoing in the Philippines, and reforms on medical cannabis in Thailand. Clearly, Southeast Asia is experiencing a variety of approaches to control drugs, which prompts the opportunity for this dialogue today. It is exciting that this event will also serve as the global launch for Drug Policies and Development, Conflict and Coexistence, the 12th volume of the International Development Policy series. The publication explores the relationship between international drug policy and development goals, both current and within a historic perspective. Contributions address the drugs and development nexus from a range of critical viewpoints, highlighting gaps in contributions, as well as exploring strategies and opportunities for enhanced linkages between drug control and development programming. Criminalization and coercive law enforcement-based responses in international and national level drug control are shown to undermine peace, security, and development objectives. We are quite lucky to have authors of this publication serve as speakers for this event. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our keynote and speakers for this event. I will start by providing introductions to all speakers, and then we will proceed with the keynote. So first, I'll introduce our keynote, Professor Dr. Prof. Adiba Kalmarozaman, also known as Prof. Adiba, graduated from Monash University in 1987 and trained in internal medicine and infectious diseases at the Monash Medical Center and Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital, Melbourne, Australia. She is presently the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, and an adjunct associate professor at Yale. She established the Center of Excellence for Research in AIDS, CERiA, that conducts multidisciplinary research on HIV and infectious diseases ranging from clinical to public health and policy research. Prof. Adiba has used her clinical and academic leadership to engage in international, regional, national, and community response to HIV/AIDS, has sat on numerous expert panels, and has provided guidance to a plethora of up-and-coming leaders in the HIV realm. She is currently chairman of the Malaysian AIDS Foundation and an executive council member of the Malaysian AIDS Council. She also serves as the president of the International AIDS Society, the world's largest association of HIV/AIDS professionals with 11,600 members from over 170 countries as of July 2020. Welcome, Prof. Adiba. Next we have John Collins. And John is a director of academic engagement at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. He served as executive director of the London School of Economics International Drug Policy Unit, was a fellow of the LSC US Center, and a distinguished visiting fellow of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Illicit Economics and Development, published by LSE Press. His historical research focuses on the political economy of international drug control. He earned a PhD from the Department of International History at the London School of Economics, looking at Anglo-American relations and international drug control from 1939 to 1964, a period culminating in the creation of the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961. His contemporary policy interests focus on the political economy of international drug control and the evolving dynamics of national and international policy reforms. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Next, we have Anne Fordham. Anne is the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, also known to everyone as IDPC, and over the last 10 years has built the network from 30 to over 190 organizations. She leads international advocacy efforts on drug policy and human rights and is the chair of the Strategic Advisory Group to the United Nations on Drug Use and HIV. She is regularly invited to comment on global drug policy issues in the media. She holds a master's degree in human rights from Sussex University, where she specialized in human rights and harm reduction. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
Next, we have Tuesday Raitano. Tuesday is the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She was previously a policy specialist in the UN system, and she has served in expert capacities and advisory capacities for a wide range of multilateral bodies and states in strengthening responses to organized crime. Welcome, Tuesday.
Hi, thank you.
And last but not least, welcome Khalid Tanasti. Khalid is the director of the Global Commission on Drug Policy and a research and teaching fellow at the Global Studies Institute at the University of Geneva. He holds a PhD in political science from the Catholic University of Paris and has held research fellowships at the Graduate Institute in Switzerland and Swansea University in the UK. Khalid is the author of scientific papers and policy reports with the focus on public policies, democracy, and the role of elections, speaking of elections, right? And international drug control mechanisms. Welcome, Khalid.
Thank you very much, Hassan. My pleasure to be here.
So now that we've welcomed all of our speakers, we will start with our keynote, Prof. Adiba, who will be discussing drug policy and the Sustainable Development Goals in Southeast Asia. Prof. Adiba, stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Hassan, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be with friends, Khalid, John, Anne, and Tuesday. Very nice to meet you for the first time. And to be involved in this global launch of the drug policies and development. So congratulations to all of you authors of this important publication. I just want to start by kind of going back to my own personal involvement in drug policy reform, and that started with harm reduction in trying to mitigate the escalating HIV epidemic in Malaysia more than 10 years ago. When it became very clear that although harm reduction is instrumental in controlling the HIV epidemic, but we were not really addressing the real problem, which is the war on drugs, the incarceration of people who use drugs, the punitive approach to drug use in Malaysia, which has led to severe overcrowding in prisons, financial burden on people who use drugs and their families, and that vicious ongoing cycle of incarceration and release, incarceration and release, and exposure to infectious diseases in prison. So although there were positive results from the harm reduction per se in terms of the reduction of the HIV epidemic amongst people who inject drugs in Malaysia, many of us involved in this felt that that certainly wasn't enough, and that has led to a coalition of academics, NGOs, and now even people in the legal system to really look at drug policy reform. And in the last 2 years, we had made some headway into it with some real discussions around decriminalization. Unfortunately, there's been a change in government, and now with the COVID pandemic, that has also put our efforts back a few steps. But the eternal optimist that I am, and with every, what do they say, with every challenge, there's always an opportunity. And I think in some ways, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic probably presents us with some opportunities to keep the discussion going. And in fact, to bring the discussion to an even louder note, simply because, as with many countries around the world, what we're seeing is outbreaks of COVID-19 in prisons. And that certainly is the case in Malaysia currently. Several of the what we call clusters in many states in Malaysia are originating from either detention centers or prisons. And our colleagues, Hassan and I, and several groups are now working very hard to put together some proposals to the government to mitigate the ever-growing concern around COVID-19 in prisons. Malaysia, for those of you who may not be aware, at the beginning of the epidemic had done really, really well in controlling the pandemic and really, alongside Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan, etc. But unfortunately now we are having what is known as a second or third surge. And as I said earlier, seems to be emanating from detention centers and prisons. So that, as I said, gives us an opportunity to advocate to the government for short and long-term strategies to address this, which obviously with 60% of people who are in prison are amongst people who use drugs. That is a very good starting point in terms of the discussion with the government on how to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic as a result of severe overcrowding in prison. So there are some short-term strategies that we want to put forward, including moratorium and new arrests, alternatives to incarceration, decarceration, as well as urgently better access to treatment and healthcare and services within the prison setting and places of detention. Long-term strategies, however, will obviously require much more thought. Firstly, the punitive drug policies have steadily increased rates of incarceration, and I think now we're like twice the number of people who should be in prison for the capacity of the prison system that we have. Secondly, it's become clear that the prison system is ill-equipped to withstand the harsh impacts of the pandemic and infectious diseases. And thirdly, of course, the widespread release of prisoners in a matter of a few short months has highlighted the arbitrary nature of laws. So if we can do it in this COVID pandemic times, why is it so difficult to look at those same so-called crimes in a different light with different kinds of sanctions and punishments? So with these three systemic realities, our drug policy reform, is in a good place, I guess, to discuss with the government some long-term strategies to prevent prison overcrowding and future infectious disease outbreaks. Now, how does all this relate to sustainable development goals? How do these drug policies relate to the SDGs? The real question is, how don't they relate, right? So this so-called, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but all of you know that the war on drugs has not only failed, but it has undermined efforts to tackle poverty, improve access to health, protect the environment, reduce violence, and equally importantly, protect the human rights of the most marginalized communities worldwide. It's clear that drug policy is a development issue, and it's clear that we'll be hard-pressed to achieve the SDGs by 2030 unless we end the war on drugs. Now, let me just pick out a few of the SDG targets and relate it to the need for drug policy reform. For instance, Target 1.1, which says by 2030, the goal is to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere. Now, many of us know that many people join the drug market as a strategy to mitigate hunger and food insecurity. So goal 1 will only be achieved if the most marginalized communities, which include those involved in illicit crop cultivation, production, and trafficking, are given viable alternatives. In Malaysia, many of those who have been severely impacted by the punitive war on drugs, who've been incarcerated, come from what is termed in Malaysia as the B40 group. So those in lower income group of the Malaysian population. SDG 3.3, by 2030, the target is to end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. Now, as we all know, and as highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, prisons are an incubator for infectious diseases. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, we know that there have been tuberculosis outbreaks and many other infectious diseases from the prisons. So, as is famously said, health is public health, and if we don't control these infectious diseases, whether it's HIV or TB or COVID-19, in this closed settings, prisons, detention centers, we will not bring an end to AIDS, TB, and other infectious diseases. What about Target 5.1, which is to end all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere? And we know that punitive drug policies impact women and girls disproportionately compared to men. And lastly, Target 16.1, which is to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Now, drug policies or the war on drugs have literally created conflict-related deaths in many parts of the world, and through measuring the impact of drug policies, we can, on conflict-related death, we can help better understand how these policies can feed into existing armed conflicts. And in places where drug production, trafficking, or consumption contribute to conflict, it's unlikely that governments will be able to reach this target 16.1 unless a drastic change of policy takes place. So in this COVID-19 era, by integrating drug policy reform strategies with the Sustainable Development Goals, we hope we can allow drug policy to be discussed from interdisciplinary angles and incorporate many new stakeholders from civil society, private and public sectors to the table. Certainly in Malaysia, that's what we're starting to see. We have a WhatsApp group called the Prison Overcrowding COVID WhatsApp group that brings together people like us, NGOs working with people who use drugs, NGOs who work with prisoners, lawyers, and other academics. So we're really excited, and although there was a setback with the change in government and COVID, we're pushing on. Actually, I think Asan, correct me if I'm wrong, but we seem to now have more people to the table, more concerned people to hopefully work with us on developing evidence-based drug policies in Malaysia and the region, and bring this to our policymakers, to their attention, whilst COVID is fresh in everybody's minds. So thank you very much, and good luck with the launch of the publication, and I look forward to reading it and using your words of wisdom in the publication as part of our advocacy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Prophet. You know, I'll just comment with saying, with every challenge there is an opportunity, and you're certainly right. And I think that's something that the movement has embraced for so long. And thank you so much. Next, we will go to Khalid, who will give us a background on the publication and share a few words on the official launch. Khalid, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Asan, and I'm very, very thankful for your support and for CERiA to welcoming us here and for Dato Adiba to be around and for your work. I also want to thank all the people we don't really acknowledge, but that have been doing the work behind to get us together here in the team of the Global Commission and the team of International Development Policy and CERiA, of course. But also to thank the authors and for being here and for taking their time to share with us their views and their articles that are specific for the region. I personally am very, very, as one of the editors of this issue, I'm very happy to be here with the colleagues and everyone who's joined us from Southeast Asia, one of my favorite regions in the world that has brought so much inspiration on so many different issues and has shown really how sustainable development is key to address the issues of inequality, etc. So just very briefly to go into the why we have came into this special issue. So the idea was really a discussion between international development policy and the Global Commission to look into the perspectives of what are we missing in this discussion? Where are we missing? Where are we going to go to make sure that our two worlds meet up, because they don't meet up. And I wanted to thank Professor Adiba because you have said too many things that really link into why this has come to be born to start with. So in the last decade, or even in the last 15 years, we have built all the advocacy and brought in the evidence from the ground, really based on two big pillars, that of criminal justice reform and correctional policies, and the other one on public health and on the impact on infectious diseases and access to essential medicines. And those were two very, very strong. One of them brought us a lot of problems because nothing has really evolved. That was the one on incarceration and criminal justice. And although decriminalization is advancing around the world, and on the other hand, there was the other that has brought us a lot of benefits, but then had the risk of over-medicalizing the response, which is the public health. And we have learned so much from the harm reduction and the HIV response, actually in the research, but also in the advocacy, etc. So the idea there was, for the next decade, how do we really try to make sure to show all the diverse impacts and effects of current repressive policies that really respond only to one side, which is that of elimination of recreational use and leaving behind the legitimate other uses, etc., leaving behind the impacts on the ground. And how do we build up the evidence around that? And the idea was really to look into how also you were saying in the keynote speech on this cross-cutting nature that goes through all of the development goals. And this has been very problematic since, of course, since 2013 and the beginning of the discussion on the post-2015 development agenda, because there was a target 3.9 that is there, 3.5, sorry, that is there, and that no one knows how to use and that no one knows how even to measure. So there has always been this embarrassment to address drug policy and drug control, because statistically also it remains not that relevant in the statistics for the SDGs and for the indicators. It is cross-cutting, it touches a lot, but could be eaten up and dismissed through other statistics. So the idea was really to bring that. Of course, we were extremely, extremely lucky to build up this special issue with two huge specialists of development. We had really the honor of having Julia Buxton, who has worked for a very long time on drugs and development, and that has brought us really that perspective from development into the drug policy view. And also we have the, of course, excellent, and we were very lucky to have her, the Chancellor of the University of Ghana, who is also a member of the West Africa Commission on Drugs, so is also in the board of IDPC, Mary Chineri Hesse. So it was through this group really from different perspectives. I mean, we are a group with one that is half European, half African, and one African and one European. And we really have tried to come together and bring like different perspectives, regional perspectives, to bring in, different expertise, to bring in also to open this into not only researchers and academia, but also to professionals, to people that are putting the services on the ground. We have decided to mix up conceptual, really theoretical research, but also empirical examples and research on the ground. So we have country examples from Afghanistan with the excellent David Mansfield, one of the largest specialists on alternative development in Afghanistan, in Mexico, in South Africa. So we have different articles on just different issues. Now, just to do very briefly, so we can hear from the authors that have a lot of more interesting things to say than I do as a co-editor, just to say that for the structure, it was really built up into three big pillars, let's say, to some extent. At the beginning, it was very, very important to remind and to remember that all the issues around development have been those that have been focused in the global debate on alternative development and on those rural, etc., policies that exist in the plant producing regions. We have had, of course, excellent contributions that have showed us the historical milestones we'll hear from John today, but also the real issues put on the ground from different perspectives, but also recommendations of these researchers and how things can be done better. Then we went into the second part, which is, I'm sorry, I have an article in it, but it's still my favorite because it's brand new. So what we call the human development, it is an article where we brought in quite new perspectives. So with Tuesday that we have today, she looked into the illicit proceeds and what does drug policy really means in a conflict situation and where does it impact on the peace processes. We have also, as you've been saying, Hassan, and today is the day, we have looked into the neo-patrimonial nature of what we call transit and production countries at the time of 1961 that coincided with independence for so many, and how that has created the bed for infiltration and has really created what we see today of this very strong impact on electoral processes, on electoral competition and participation. And we have had an interview with former president of Timor-Leste, Jose Ramos Rota, who gives us his perspective on criminal justice in Southeast Asia, his perspective on the death penalty, and his perspective when he was the representative of the UN in Guinea-Bissau. Now, the third part that is really also important is what we call the cross-cutting issues. And there, instead of looking into drug policy, we looked at drug policy, for example, instead of looking at other issues that are linked to drug policy, we looked from the perspective of the issues into drug policy and how that impacts. So basically on gender issues in Mexico, we looked into how drug policy makes it even harder to achieve better status for women in criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. We have looked into children and the impact of children on scheduling drugs. I mean, when I say we, it was the authors of the different articles. So this whole special issue by international development policy is our opportunity as researchers and as practitioners working on drug policy to also connect with the development world. And we have been very grateful to have this vehicle, which is the International Development Policy, who already works and has that perspective on development. And so just to finish up, I would say again that we are very, very thankful to have had the opportunity to work with CERiA and to have this Kuala Lumpur presentation being the first one. We're going to be going around the world as Hassan said, and we have also a lounge event in Geneva on the 24th of November. But I'm saying it also because Dato Adiba is a member of the International Geneva and of our community as chair of the International AIDS Society. So everyone else, thank you very much for being here, but also you're also always welcome to all other regional discussions. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Khalid. And I think that gives a really nice summary of the publication and of the strategies for the global tour. And it's a good save the date, I think, for the audience. Just so bringing it back to some housekeeping, if you just joined, welcome again. On the right-hand side, there is a chat box. Please feel free to write questions that you may have for any speakers as we proceed with the event. So let's continue with our speakers. Thank you, Khalid. And next we have John Collins, who will be discussing chapter 3 of the publication, Imperial Drug Economies, Development and the Search for Alternatives in Asia from Colonialism to Decolonialism. John, the stage is yours.
Thank you to the organizers, Prof. Adiba. It's always a pleasure to listen to her speak, and thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Khalid and Julia, and all the organizers of this special issue and the international development policy. I think it really is a testament to how important this topic is, but also to the work that they did in pulling together what really is, I think, an outstanding special issue. So I'm really delighted to be part of it. As was said, my focus is on the history of this. and trying to draw some new narratives, I think, around the history of this. And what I'll begin by saying is, I think we have a lot of, particularly in the last few years, the political economy of drug control, I think we have some very good analyses coming out. But I would asterisk that a little bit and say, I think the history is actually probably our weakest part at this point. That we kind of have these historical narratives or assumptions about how these economies developed throughout the past in Asia in particular, and we extrapolate through the present from those. So what my paper has been about is trying to really analyze some of the complexities around the evolution of drug economies in Asia, and also the complexities around attempts to regulate drug economies in Asia, and how that really feeds into the present day, and what are the continuing implications of that. So I begin with just some context. So famous historian William O. Walker said, there's no way to understand foreign and security policies in Asia without understanding opium's role. Right, so we're not talking about an issue that is secondary importance or not of immediate relevance, right? As I will argue repeatedly throughout this, illicit drug economies were absolutely fundamental when we think about the development of economies, society, government in Asia. It's just there, it's completely inextricable to that story. And so what my paper does is try to expand that historical point that Walker makes to say that there's no way to understand economic development or development policy in Asia without understanding the role of drugs. So I think we end up, because as I was saying, we lack this kind of really historical nuance on the political economy of drugs. We end up relying, I think, on simple periodizations, and I think that we do ourselves a disservice. So we kind of tend to think of there were these massive inflection points. So at one time drugs were legal, the next moment they're illegal. So pre-1912 maybe, or pre-1961. And in reality, what we saw over the last several hundred years is a very slow, staggered evolutionary process of policy, but also the interaction and development of these local drug markets. So one of my key points is drugs in development is fundamentally a historical process of state regulation, control, setting of geographical boundaries, both economically and physically, right? So you cannot understand, for example, the geographic boundaries and how they to some degree settled, but also how populations settled around those boundaries without understanding the drug economies in those areas. So one of the key arguments I make is that drugs and development have always been fundamentally linked. And we have some really great analysis today of how UN policies are interacting with drugs. If you look at the UNDP work, you look at the work of the Global Commission, others. But actually, what I've tried to highlight is these discussions have been ongoing for centuries. It's just, it wasn't under terminology that we would know today. But if we think of the globalization of drugs trade, or we think of the general process of globalization, or we think of mercantilist imperial policies, we think of processes of state formation, the limits of governance, right? You think of Britain and Burma and how policy there actually derived from the fundamental limits of governance in those areas. And then if we think also about how drugs affected the distribution of economic gains in those areas over a multi-century perspective, as I'm going to highlight, Carl Trocchi talks a lot about how important opium farming economies were. When I say farming, I mean the revenue economies, the taxation economies were to the emergence of capital accumulation and the emergence of capitalist societies in those areas. So the two are to some degree inextricable. And when you think of these large scale economic outcomes, well, of course, there's a huge political and social element to that as well. So the political economies elements derive from that to such a large degree. And this all stretches from this dialectic between local and global. And so to understand the global, you have to understand how local policies were changing, and to some degree, vice versa. And then to reiterate my point, what we term alternative development today, it's a paradigm today, or we can call it sustainable development, we can call it what we like. Many of these principles, if you go back and read the documents of colonial administrators or post-colonial administrators, many of those principles were ingrained in state responses over the last several centuries. So here's one of my key points, is that the globalization of the opium trade in Asia, for example, resembled the globalization of transnational labor and population flows. So as populations began to move more significantly around Asia, or you see free wage labor markets starting to emerge, so too the drug markets track that. So actually, if you look at a League of Nations report in the 1930s, they're arguing that Chinese immigration was one of the key determinants of whether areas developed large-scale opium consumption patterns. What we also saw was that there was actually a plurality of regulatory frameworks. So actually, you would see rules in different colonial settings, which would say, well, Chinese immigrant populations are allowed to consume opium, but other indigenous groups are not allowed. So we saw actually quite a tapestry of regulatory approaches to this. And you can also see the embers of this kind of racialized approach to drug policy. Again, it's this constant leitmotif of drug policy over the centuries of just, it's not the substance, it's who's perceived to use the substance that often drives policy. The fact that drug markets evolved alongside globalization meant that they were in a process of globalization. So as Pierre Chouvi writes, there's a reason why Thailand emerged into a privileged hub of heroin trafficking. It was to do with the emergence of how certain tribes crisscrossed across Siam in the early years. Similarly, production and consumption is an important part of history. And I think we really overlook this to some degree as we think about how regulations emerged. So technology as a key driver of enabling just mass production of these substances and mass trading of these substances meant that they were increasingly ubiquitous. They meant that they were something that, as David Courtwright writes, have increasingly visible impacts and economic impacts. Not necessarily just negative, but just we have to observe the impacts that they were having in societies, and that's what draws states towards regulating them. So as Spillane and McAllister write, the question at the turn of the 20th century was not whether states would seek to regulate these substances. The question was whose authority would be privileged, right? We can think of the pharmaceutical and the medical industry in the United States wanting to control much of the way that drugs are regulated and distributed. And then similarly, if we think of the role of India, for example, right, that you cannot understand post-World War II opium or drug trades in Asia without looking at the long process around the development of India as a hub. And the geopolitical issues that came from that, right? We think of the long-term impacts of the opium wars in China, which again, fundamentally derived from this issue of defining the boundaries between legal and illegal, defining the boundaries between whether states can forcibly export commodities into states that don't necessarily want them. And I think that gives something that I'm particularly interested in, which is this revisionist historiography around multilateral drug control, that it is a longer historical process, that there was more actors involved. You know, China is overlooked as one of the key protagonists in the creation of the multilateral drug control system. So it's really not one that's readily distilled to these hegemonic analyses or this US centrism. We have to understand, again, the local, we have to understand what was happening in these areas and how the political economy was adjusting around these markets. For example, as I said, if we look at the opium tax farms, I put a quote up from Trocky there, that ultimately, you know, businessmen, their profits, their ability to buy political influence all came from attempts to regulate these systems and had long-term spillover effects for these economies. Now, I critique Trocky to some degree because I say, well, you know, this focus on this imperial inflection overshadows local dynamics to some degree. And I think we need to dissociate that a little bit, and that this is a longer term research agenda that I'm highlighting, but I think we need to dissociate that to some degree. And also I think his efforts to kind of fetishize opium as a sole determinant of imperial expansion. Again, I think it is this issue of trying to give agency to communities and societies that are largely overlooked in Western-centric historiography, because naturally we just look to sources that are Western. Right, the British Empire kept good records, so that's where historians tend to write the history from. Similarly, the idea of I think there's an orthodoxy, not in say drug policy reform, but I know there was a BBC article in 2019, which effectively the headline was to the effect how opium impoverished India. And actually, there's some really, really interesting historical work trying to quantify what the impacts of the opium economy were on India. And it's not conclusive, but I think Richard's work highlights that, well, more than likely, the harms were vastly overstated. There were these moralizing reformist narratives in, say, the UK or the US, which overstated the harms of these drugs on these communities and vastly understated the economic dislocation that came from the changes of that economy, from the collapse of the opium economy in India. And so if we look to work like Richard's and others, I think we start to see a research agenda start to emerge around this. Similarly, if we look to Burma, I think that's the clearest example. I've written a lot on this, and I spent a lot of time in the archives on this. That's the clearest example where you're reading you're reading documents from colonial administrators at the time who are basically saying, well, this is complicated. We don't have control in certain areas. We don't want to upset this delicate political balance that we have. I'm not saying that's a positive or a negative. I'm just saying the narratives that we know today actually are very closely echoed in the narratives of the 1930s. You know, well, prohibition is just going to produce a large illicit market. So we're not necessarily sure that's the best thing to do. And I think I've framed it as, I think ultimately, you could think of how the British approached Burma as, look, maybe we're moving towards a new regulatory framework, but let's not throw everything out to get there. Let's not rush into this kind of prohibitionist paradigm. And interestingly, I think when you...
Sorry, John, yeah. not to cut you off, but 30 seconds, just so we can all of our speakers in time. I think it's fantastic, but sure, 30 seconds. Yeah.
Well, so I'll highlight something that is brought out again and again, is that this kind of two sides of development and drugs, right? On the one side, you have this kind of alienating force all through the centuries, where you've got mainstream development processes, mainstream political development, and to some degree, these economies separate the communities from their political core. But also they enable forms of development. You know, they provide cash crops, self-sufficiency, capital accumulation, resources that they can use to pay for health, economic, and security services. And so we really need to do a better job, I think, of unpicking how those impacted these regions and these economies. So I'll leave it there, actually, but thank you very much.
Sorry, John, to cut you off early. I think it's fantastic. And to be honest with you, I would certainly want to listen to more, and I know everyone feels similarly. Thank you so much, John, for I think the financial aspect and the economic aspect, similar to what Adiba mentioned, you know, it really is affecting all players from all angles. And so thank you. So moving forward, next we have Tuesday. Tuesday we'll be discussing Chapter 7 of the publication, Making War, Conflict Zones and Their Implications for Drug Policy. And again, kind reminder, everybody, if you have questions, please list them in the Zoom chat. We will try to make some time for the Q&A at the end to address those questions. Tuesday, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and part of this panel, as it was a great pleasure to have contributed to this important volume and all of the thought leaders that it brought together in thinking through the contemporary challenges of drug policy and the opportunities, I think. And certainly all of the presentations today have raised a number of questions which will require a serious thought. And from the perspective of a program policy person, some of the questions that we have asked is, what does it mean that we have to do differently? And I think that's the discussion that I'd like to focus on in my couple of minutes of remarks today. Because we opened from the question of, you know, do we need to and do we want to marry together the communities of international security, peace and conflict with the drug policy community? And if so, what value can we bring to the table? In the first point is like, should we? Certainly the evidence that we've seen looking at the evolution of different forms of conflict over the last 2 decades, 3 decades even now, since time's running so fast, is that there is an intersection, that it is incontrovertible that there is a link between narcotics production, trafficking and use, and the most serious conflicts that we've seen in every continent, from Latin America, Europe, Eurasia, Asia, and Africa. My organization, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, did an analysis, and this is only an indicator, but I think it's worth mentioning, of all of the UN Security Council resolutions that have been approved since the turn of the millennium, year 2000, between 2000 and 2019, which is a total of 1,167 resolutions. And at least 10% of them every single year, and accelerating in quantity year on year, mention drug trafficking, which is, I mean, a very notable indicator that in the thought around at the highest levels, peace and security, we're also talking about the drug debate. Some of these would be obvious to you, thinking through, of course, the fact that the world's largest source of heroin, Afghanistan, is one of the most protracted conflicts that we have in the contemporary environment. Colombia, similarly, leading producer of cocaine. And for our regional discussion in Myanmar, opium production was clearly linked into the funding of the civil war and preventing its resolution. So how do we then take this forward as a discussion? What we saw, I think, is that there is almost a generational shift in the way that we understood the nexus between the drug trade and conflict. From these three first initial country examples where the emphasis was on production zones, through to the more contemporary and ongoing conflicts now, places like Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Libya, CERiA, where it's not a large-scale crop production zone where you can see visible production and control and measure the amount of territory that is or is not being used for production. Instead, it's often a transit trade. And there is plenty of evidence and a growing body of evidence that for international networks focused on the movement of illicit narcotics, there is an attraction to moving through conflict spaces. And there is also production of sort of non-agricultural narcotic drugs. So methamphetamines in CERiA, for example, and Captagon have been an enormous fueler of different parties to the conflict, and not always the on the ground armed soldiers. We did a study jointly with Interpol and a Norwegian Center for Global Analysis known as RIPTO, which examined the proceeds from different illicit economies in conflict zones and found that drug trafficking was the largest, contributing some 28% of the income to non-state armed groups and terrorist organizations in zones of conflict around the world. But what was interesting in that analysis was that only 4% of it was actually being used in the zone of conflict. A lot of it was then flowing out of the conflict to proxy actors who, by their financial influence, were impacting on the dynamics of the conflict on the ground. So there's a lot to unpack in that, but it certainly speaks to the fact that we need to continue to evolve our thinking around what does the drug policy discussion need to know and understand about the role of the narcotic industry in a conflict zone. And then the question is, what do we bring to the table? So shifting into the second half of our discussion, and very cognizant of time, so I know I'm sorry, moving very quickly. We put on the table in the chapter a discussion around what we've termed the violent governance paradigm, which is kind of a reinforcing set of interdependencies, much like John's presentation, focusing on the value of high-value narcotics trades in conflict and how they create a dynamic that feeds on a violent, disruptive element and a degradation of the quality of governance and the rule of law. So in this paradigm, and sorry, it's a little bit academic, but it makes logical sense. You see the enormous profits coming out of the drug trade and other forms of illicit economies being fed to people who can control the territory in which they're either produced, through which they traffic, or where they are sold. And often that ability to control territory is directly correlated to your ability to take a monopoly on violence, or at least inflict sufficient levels of violence that you can command some legitimacy with local populations. So essentially you see the challenge between the legitimate rent-seeking or tax-taking of a state versus the criminal rent-seeking, extortion, protection, taxation that organized crime groups do. Very much the same kind, it's one of the largest drivers now of armed groups financing is the ability to tax local populations. And if you have drugs flowing through, you're seeing an enormous source of criminal rents. With all of those, with that financing, they're then able to buy more arms. They're able to distribute some of that wealth into the community and increasing their hold then on that territorial space. Their ability to control territory then, of course, translates into political leverage. If you have a caliphate, to use a bad but obvious example, you have leverage in a discussion around peace building, around the distribution of assets, around political legitimacy. So if you can go through that circle, securing resources, securing territory, securing political leverage, you can then cycle back to once you have political leverage, you have a greater and higher level of legitimacy, which again reinforces your ability to control territory, control resources, and so forth. So that was the violent governance paradigm. And what it what its implications in the study, I think, of drug policy and drug responses were for us is how inherently political this discussion is. So whereas I think it's often, and my panelist friends and colleagues might disagree, but I think there's been a reluctance to a certain extent of the drug policy community to move into what is actually the very securitized space of drug responses to drug trafficking or into conflict zones. This was already a security-led discussion. So whereas the drug policy community is trying to lead with a harm reduction approach, with a very development-centric approach, to say and stake a claim or plant a flag into this conflict space, comes with an inherent risk that they are securitizing their own agenda. I would argue, by contrast, it's actually very much what we need them to do. So coming from a peace building perspective, and I worked on a lot of peacekeeping missions and post-conflict discussions, what you see in these conflicts where there is a heavy illicit economy, drug trafficking dynamic, is that the peace builders and the development practitioners and those who are focused on the dynamics of the conflict say, well, we have this illicit economy problem. And as soon as you talk about organized crime and the illicit economy, the first hands to go up in the room are the law enforcement, which is, we have an answer to this problem. We can deal with this issue. We will, build national capacity into state security organizations. We will militarily control areas. We will da-da-da-da-da. But all of this investment into the security arms of whether it's state or international actors, peacekeeping troops, and or independent, sometimes even armed militia groups to address the illicit economy, comes with an enormous human rights cost. It comes with a development cost, often resulting in a far higher escalation of the levels of violence because you create a counter drugs agenda into the political dynamic. So there's an enormous amount of money put into the fight against narcotics trafficking. It was estimated in a report as being about $100 billion a year. So when there's $100 billion worth of resources on the table to prevent narcotics trafficking, you get as much interest in becoming an anti-narcotics agenda as you do in the illicit economy itself. Though it should be said that just the cocaine economy alone is said to generate 300 billion. So 100 billion in narcotics control is still not an even scale. So the question then is, if you have this space where law enforcement is the first hand up in the room and really no other voices offering a point of discussion or an alternative, I would say there's a really strong argument for saying that the drug policy community should be present and active and engaged in saying there are development responses that need to be thought through, there are development implications that need to be thought through, and harm reduction is as valid a conflict concept here as it is in non-conflict spaces. I think the problem though, and it's not a problem I can solve well, but we actually don't have great alternatives. So having in discussions, with UN member states and in discussions around, well, okay, what does a development-led response to organized crime look like? What does alternative livelihoods look like when you're not talking about production zones, but you're talking about militia groups involved in trafficking? What do we offer them as a viable alternative? Or when they turn around and says, okay, we understand what you're saying and the validity of your points, what do you want us to do differently? It's actually quite hard to answer that question. So my conclusion, at least in the article, is there is a rationale, and an important one, for taking a drug policy lens into a conflict zone. But until we have something sound to say, we ought to be very careful about speaking up. So I would argue very much for innovation. I would argue very much for experimentation, trialing different approaches, seeing if they work, learning lessons, building the evidence, bringing it to the table. But there certainly isn't, I think, and this is very sad, but very true, there isn't a confident development community answer to addressing the intersection between the illicit economy, narcotics, the narcotics trade, and conflict zones.
Thank you, TK. That, I think, is fantastic. And I think I'm getting so many texts from so many different places just listening to you. People are asking me, where can I get a copy of the book? Where can I, how can I get in touch with Tuesday? And same with John and I think it's fantastic that we have this a very exciting book conversation with the various publications or the various chapters. I will make clear though, you can access the book for free. I think there is a link that we'll provide where you can access the PDF of the book for everyone who is interested in reading and learning more. And we'll also share contact information with the speakers. So if you want to send them emails or whatnot, you can do so. Okay, thank you so much, Tuesday. And to move forward now, I will transition to our last speaker, Anne. And Anne will be discussing chapter 9 of the publication, the meaningful participation of stakeholders. And I think this is a really good wrap, I think, for the speakers as well, in global drug policy debates, a policy comment. Anne, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hassan, for your excellent sharing and kind words. And it's really been a great pleasure to be part of this initiative. You know, I'm not from an academic background, as many of you are aware, you know, and have mostly been engaged in, civil society engagement in drug policy debates at the global, regional, and then supporting IDPC members also at the national level. So it isn't really surprising that this is my contribution to this very important edition, I think, as other colleagues have already said, and it's really been a pleasure to be a part of it. Basically the chapter that I wrote was really trying to unpick some of these terms around meaningful participation, stakeholders, affected communities when it comes to drug control policies. And I think these are important questions because we know that in policymaking, there are numerous commitments to ensure that the people most affected and civil society are meaningfully engaged in the decisions that affect their lives and have a right to participate in those decisions. But it is always problematic. And I think, you know, there are some specific aspects when it comes to drug policy that we need to take into account. So this sort of chapter that I wrote was a policy comment, and I sought to address 3 key questions. Who are the relevant stakeholders when it comes to drug policy? How have certain stakeholders been able to positively influence the direction of drug policy? And then who are then the most affected communities? And, you know, what are the challenges for their meaningful engagement in defining the policies that affect them? So firstly, who are the stakeholders? I mean, at the CND, with the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, you know, when they talk about all relevant stakeholders, they usually list these as law enforcement personnel, civil society, academics, you know, relevant UN entities, and then occasionally, and I think increasingly, we're seeing private sector also listed there. But just to step back a moment, I think the term stakeholder itself merits some interrogation. It is widely used across the UN system, but it actually originates from the corporate world. And corporations, by using the term stakeholders, have benefited enormously because it allows them a legitimate seat in policymaking forums that may intersect with their business interests. Importantly and problematically, it masks a power imbalance between different types of stakeholders by not differentiating between rights holders who participate in these debates and duty bearers, by treating these different types of stakeholders as equal actors. And for the participation of affected communities, this really underplays the rights of the people most affected, who are coming to these discussions as rights bearers, and in fact are at the table to hold duty bearers, in this case at the UN, member states accountable. This is increasingly relevant for drug policy and also in Asia. You know, in your introduction, Hassan, you know, you also talked about the trends towards, you know, cannabis reforms around medical cannabis. You know, how are, for example, the traditional farmers of cannabis being meaningfully included in conversations as the illicit market for medical or even broader opens up, you know, or will they be shut out in favor of corporate interests? Corporations have greater power and influence than affected communities, such as small farmers. So there's a huge power imbalance there. In drug policy, the affected communities are, they face violations of their rights. So that's why they're rights holders when they come to the table. I'm obviously moving quite quickly given the time constraints that we have. Who are the most affected when we're talking about drug policy? And again, it's important to talk about the most affected communities, even in the UNGAS outcome document, the idea that affected populations and representatives of civil society should play a participating role in policymaking and implementation. The genuine and meaningful participation of affected communities is enshrined in other political commitments and human rights instruments, in the 2030 agenda, from the HIV/AIDS movement, the involvement of people living with HIV has long been acknowledged and enshrined as a key principle of civil society engagement. In drug policy, IDPC has variously tried to define who are the most affected as people who use drugs, people involved in subsistence farming of crops deemed illicit, formerly and currently incarcerated people, indigenous people, women, children, youth. This list is not exhaustive. There are other ethnic minorities, and also, as we've also heard on this panel, people affected by the lack of access to pain and palliative care, people living in situations of conflict or fleeing violence and insecurity. I think it's important to say that across all categories, and again, Prof. Adiba also mentioned this very clearly in her opening, the burden of repression and punishment has been borne by people who are marginalized and living in situations of vulnerability. More often than not, socioeconomic vulnerability is a key characteristic of those who are most affected. And this makes sense given that the drug market serves as a survival economy. And for many living on the margins of society in situations of poverty without genuine opportunities to engage in the formal economy, the illicit market, like the drug market, is incredibly important for basic subsistence. This positive role of the drug market as a social safety net, or even, some colleagues writing on this issue have gone as far to say as a wealth creation mechanism for poor communities, has not really been taken up by the broader mainstream development actors. Others who are most affected include women who use drugs. They face much greater stigma. This deters access to health services. Women's socioeconomic vulnerability also makes them more susceptible to involvement in the drug trade. And that's why we also see that women are often incarcerated at much higher rates than men for drug offenses. And in the Asia region, Thailand, 80% of women are incarcerated for drug-related offenses. In the Philippines, it's 60%. In many places, we don't have gender disaggregated data, but we know that it is high. Of course, people of color are clearly disproportionately impacted. The UN Working Group on Peoples of African Descent has stated that the war on drugs has operated more effectively as a system of racial control than as a mechanism for combating the use and trafficking of narcotics. So in terms of, I know, Hassan, you're looking at me. Let me just end by mentioning this last point. I think when it comes to drug policy, one of the biggest challenges for meaningful participation of the most affected communities is the policy frame itself, the criminalization of affected communities, people who use drugs, subsistence farmers in particular. And this barrier to participation has not been acknowledged. It fuels stigma, it deepens marginalization and vulnerability, and it can actually be a physical barrier if people are incarcerated or serving for a criminal record. I think sort of building on Tuesday's point, governments are often resistant to civil society participation in drug policy because they see it or they frame it as a security issue. And I think that's where, I think greater work linking with civil society actors in the security peace building space around this can help because, for example, at the EU level, we see this increasing trend towards putting drug policy, in a stronger securitization frame. So just to finish, civil society participation Community-led engagement is incredibly important. We've made great strides on this in the last 20 years. If we look at the UNGAS outcome document, we look at the debates at the global level, the reform narrative is dominating, and I think it's a point in time where we need to champion, defend, and protect that space. We see that civil society space is under threat everywhere. The strides that we've made in drug policy need to be protected. We need to understand the structural barriers, criminalization, but other intersectional vulnerabilities around race and gender, and really continue to address those points to ensure that civil society and community have a place at this table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and I think a fantastic way for us to conclude. I do want to be mindful of the Q&A section that we really wanted to have, and I think we can squeeze in one question, if that's okay with the panelists. I know you all are quite busy and we want to be respectful of your time, but if you all can stick around, can we proceed with perhaps 1 or 2 questions from the audience and then wrap up? If that's okay, yeah, okay. The first question that we have is actually a quite interesting one. And it's, can any of the panelists comment on effects of the mentioned paradigm, production and trafficking in conflict zones, to adjacent non-conflict zone countries, also noting the fact that most drug enforcement bodies focus mostly on parcels drugs through sea or air routes from conflict zones. Tuesday, do you want to start with that?
Certainly, thank you so much for the question. I certainly recognize, and it is often spoken around in the responses to transnational organized crime, around the balloon effect. I mean, it's very cliched to say, but as you strengthen a response to an illicit economy and make it harder for illicit actors to operate in it, they displace their activities elsewhere. And there is no question, I think, in a discussion around the evolution of the entire supply chain of the illicit economy, so not only looking at production, but also, further downstream narcotics flows, that this is very important consideration, that you move your illicit economy actors, often sort of slightly geographically displace them into a broader area, into neighboring countries, into weaker borders. So there is certainly no question that this is and must be a concern. But I think what we broadly would say is that we're not succeeding in the first place. So our displacement considerations are secondary. Of course, we want to strengthen universally and create as much friction to the movement of the illicit economy, and the concentration of attention into key logistic hubs like ports and airports is essential. And understanding the interconnections between illicit groups. So our organization works very much from a political economy approach. It's one of the things we mentioned in the chapter, that any kind of development and intervention recognizing this paradigm is inherently political, needs to map the political economy. But there's also an assumption that underpins the balloon effect, which is that organized crime groups can move at will. They can't. There's another school of criminology that looks at how organized crime itself can move, how it entrenches itself into new territories, how it gains influence and gets to the point that it controls territory. It's not that simple or straightforward. They will always have to contend with local actors. They will always have to establish themselves and their legitimacy and create new networks of corruption that will ease their movement and their operations, and they will have to continue to defend that consistently until it's well established. So I think there will, if you can successfully break down a violent governance paradigm in one place, it will take some time before it can be rebuilt up in a new one. And that is a policy or a programmatic opportunity that you've got an entry point to actually reduce the overall levels of trafficking, if you can think forward on where it is that these flows might go.
Khalid, do you want to add to that?
Yes, just very briefly, just to remind also how the system has been also built. Like the whole system is a straitjacket, the control system. It is all built as an international cooperation response to drug trafficking. And I mean, I think that John and Tuesday and Anne have showed us how important it is to look into the local concept. And this is also a future discussion. So it has been built as a control system also during the end of the Second World War, when there was one part that was the hegemonic, one interests that were the hegemonic ones, when a lot of countries were getting their independence, when Europe was in reconstruction efforts, et cetera, et cetera. And still today we have this balance that is global, preserving the interests only of what was called before the consuming countries, regardless of the impacts on the ground. So I just wanted to say that this is a key discussion for the future, because the frameworks need to be a lot more regional than they are today, in a very strict jacket, international one that does not allow countries to, or regional blocks of countries, to see the challenges that they face and do better in the response. Just to add up to what Tuesday had said. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. And then I think the last question, to be mindful of time, and also just to give credit, that first question was from Ravi Ramada. So Ravi, thank you so much for your question. And going on to our last question of the webinar, this is from Jerome. And he starts by saying, my question is for Anne, but for all speakers too. In your opinion, how do you improve the involvement of drug user communities in advocacy and activism for a better drug policy and the end of abusive incarceration and police brutality in countries where using still is illegal and is very discriminate? It's dangerous to assume and claim your drug user status if you risk going to jail.
I can respond. I mean, it is the key question, and I think a very important one. And that's, why at the international level for a long time, those of us involved in advocacy around harm reduction, HIV, drug policy, advocate for funding and support for drug user groups, networks of people who use drugs, to organize at the national level and to be able to speak out, claim their rights. Of course, it's super challenging. It can be dangerous to come out about your drug use, and that is definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. But there is power in organizing, and also linking to the international movement. The international network of people who use drugs is doing great work, is very visible in claiming that space and supporting drug user groups at the national level to organize and to be visible. And that visibility, being connected to an international network, can afford you at least some level of protection. So I think, it's a challenge, but I think we have to ensure funding, support, organizational development support to networks of people who use drugs. It has to be part of a strategy, and governments should be supporting that, because we want to hear from the people most affected as we're shifting and changing and designing new policies.
And ending from a quote from our keynote, Prof. Adiba, with every challenge, there is an opportunity. So, keeping that as a way to continue the momentum going is so critical, especially amidst this COVID era as well. Okay, everybody, I think that is a wrap for today's webinar. Just a few more points. We will send a follow-up survey to everybody for your comments and feedback. We will also send a link of the excellent publication that we've officially, Khalid, I think, launched today. And also for next engagements and next webinars, I know that Khalid and team is planning a series of different engagements. So be on the lookout for those. And thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time and effort to be here with us today. Special thanks to our team that is in Geneva, to Dom, to Isabella, to Martin for all their efforts controlling the webinar system. And thank you to our speakers, to Tuesday and John, Prof. Adiba, Khalid, for all taking the time to be here as well. And thank you everyone else for joining us. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you.